Hey guys, BuildZoid here, and today we're back with the Core i5-13600K on the MSI Z790 Edge motherboard with the Kingston Fury 6000 CL36 2x16 DDR5 memory kit. So this video is a follow-up to the previous video. In the previous video, I sort of showed the overclocking process that I went through with this memory kit on this motherboard with this CPU. And today we're just sort of taking a look at the settings that I ultimately settled on in terms of, like, it's stable and it doesn't, well, mostly that it's stable and what the performance looks like. Actually, we're not really going to take a, well, so the funny thing is, in terms of timings, this is exactly the same settings that I had towards the end of the previous video, and I ran a bunch of benchmarks there. So if you want to see those, I mean, I'll show you a quick IDA run, but, like, we're not even going to close hardware info, so it's going to be not ideal, but yeah, just to sort of give you some idea of how this performs right now. Actually, no, I might close hardware info. Yeah, well, the issue is, like, once I start closing stuff, I can't, like, I can't change my mind about whether I want to reshoot the video or not. So it's just like, yeah, the struggles of my awful video production style. Anyway, so let's take a look at all of the stress tests that I've run. Oh, and I guess, I don't know, should I point out, there's a fan pointed at the memory sticks, as you can see up here, so, yeah, I don't think that's an unrealistic position for a fan, right? It's not like when I usually mount it directly above the memory sticks, because I'm on a horizontal test bench and gravity will hold it in place, but anyway, yeah, so the i5 is not overclocked, it's just at stock settings, so we don't really have to worry about the cooling on that, though I did disable the E-cores because, like, HCI memtest really doesn't run them. TestMem5 sometimes does weird things when you have them turned on. So just for, like, memory stress testing purposes, it's a lot easier to just have them turned off. If you were actually, like, setting this up and you wanted to turn the E-cores back on after you set up all of your overclocks, I would still recommend that you rerun YCruncher VST, because YCruncher actually, like, it runs just fine even if you have the E-cores turned on. At least the stress test works correctly if you have the E-cores turned on, which the same cannot be said for all of the, like, a lot of the memory stress tests tend to be a bit weird with the E-cores, probably because the E-cores are a bit weird in terms of how they interact with the ring and memory controller, considering that you have, like, 4 cores in a cluster, and yeah, so anyway, HCI memtest really, really hates them in my experience. So, and it's not that it causes the stress test to, like, error out or something, it causes it to run way slower, which, if anything, is probably going to make the stress test less difficult to run. Because if you're reading less data, like, if you're running a memory stress test where you're just writing and reading data from the memory at a, as basically as quickly as you can, well, if that ends up running slower, then it's not going to be putting as much stress on the memory controller, and consequently, it'll be less good of a stress test. Anyway, so yeah, like, I have the E-cores turned off here, but you could just turn them on and then just revalidate with YCruncher VST, and you probably shouldn't have to make any adjustments unless you're really pushing your CPU frequency, which, again, that would be, like, more a CPU overclocking thing than a memory overclocking thing, in my opinion. So, yeah, anyway, and so stress tests that I've run, we have HCI memtest, 1000, over 1000%. And that ran at 41 gigabytes per second, which is what you'd expect. Well, actually, with an 8-core CPU, it can run a little bit faster because the 6-core can't quite read and write that much because the data has to go to the cores. But yeah, not bad bandwidth for DDR5-7200. And then we have TestMem5, which here I use the one Osmos V3 preset. That ran for 5 hours and 22 minutes. I've been told that apparently this preset is better for DDR5. I cannot confirm or deny that, because my experience with the Intel memory controller is basically, once you go, depending on your motherboard and your memory kit and the CPU, once you go past a certain speed, nothing works. Like, it doesn't, nothing works. Yeah, like, my experience has been that really it is every single stress test just stops being stable past a certain point. And there are some differences in terms of how quickly some of them error out, but it's not even, like, consistent differences. Like sometimes HCI will error out in 100, like if I push the memory really high. It's not here, right? This is DDR5-7200, so Intel's memory controller isn't having a existential crisis about whether or not a 1 is a 0 or not. But once you push to say, well, this motherboard in my experience starts having serious issues once you go past 7600. So on, say, this motherboard past 7600, what would happen is sometimes I'd get an error within the first 100% of HCI mem test. Sometimes I'd get an error in like 4 hours of test mem 5. Sometimes I'd get an error in 15 minutes of test mem 5. And that's why I've decided that I no longer, basically if the memory controller doesn't immediately, like if the stability, it doesn't immediately clear up with some basic adjustments, I'm not going to put any more effort into it because it just doesn't get better in my experience. Like the inconsistency of the errors at very high speeds is so great that it's just not worth the time and effort to try fix them. Especially considering that, like, let's say 7600 compared to 7200, like, that's not really a huge clock speed difference. And most of the performance benefit of manually tuning your memory comes from your memory timings, not the clock speed itself. So, yeah, like, pushing speeds where you're really sort of struggling with the memory controller just behaving really inconsistently is not worth the effort, in my opinion. Anyway, that's not a concern here. Like, these settings actually... So these settings do require manually tuning the PLL voltages, but I didn't run into any, like, oh, I really needed to fiddle with this voltage or that voltage like that. No, this was very nice and easy. Like, I ran Y-Cruncher VST once when I first adjusted the PLLs, then I locked in all of the voltages, because a lot of them were set to auto, and the motherboard didn't use any auto values that I found too high, so I just locked those in. And then I ran VST again, then I ran test mem5, then I ran HCI mem test, and then I ran VST one more time. So we have like 2 hours of VST here, and yeah, nothing errored out, not like, it's fine. And if we please tell me, yeah, no errors down here. Yeah, that's another fun, annoying thing with Intel CPUs is you can get errors down here. Since 10th gen, I think the last architecture from Intel that didn't do that was like 10th gen, and everything after 10th gen you can get actually, wait, no, it might have been 11th gen that was the only one that didn't do that. No, 10th gen did it if you had your ring clock too high, but like otherwise the memory controller was a lot more consistent. But anyway, it doesn't matter. This right here is stable, right? It runs VST, it runs test mem 5, it runs HCI mem test. I mean, we could have run a different preset of test mem 5. I don't think it would have made a difference because, yeah, like HCI and VST also aren't having any issues. So, yeah. And also, I've run all of these stress tests for a significant amount of time, right? Like, this is 5 hours of test mem 5, and, yeah, like... And then also we have the 1000% of HCI mem test, which on a 13600K does take slightly longer to run than, you know, hitting 1000% on like a 13900K. So, yeah, I'm not like, I don't have any doubts about these settings here, like coming and going in terms of stability, because we're also not at a very high speed, which is sort of the other main concern. Anyway, yeah, so. That's all the stress test passed. And I would... So, HCI mem test is like you actually need to... Well, if you want the nice UI, you need to pay for it. There is a free version. It's a bit clunky. Test mem 5 is free, but very clunky. this, like, for example, if you press the OK on this, it closes the whole thing, which, yeah, that's... If you're wondering why I had that window floating over there, that's why, because... The test doesn't stay up after you confirm that something finished. Anyway, Y-Cruncher VST is great, though. Y-Cruncher is actually, like, is not clunky. It doesn't do anything weird, so... And that's also a free stress test. Anyway, so we're going to close everything down. And now we're just going to do a quick IDA run, and then we're going to go into the board's BIOS and take a look at what the actual settings all are. I don't consider IDA a very good benchmark, but it is convenient. I'll give it that. Also, you'll get higher numbers if, like, read, write, and copy numbers will be higher if you turn the E-cores back on. Latency shouldn't change. Oh, and we're getting 53.6 nanoseconds, which is a solid number. And funnily enough, like in my experience with Intel DDR5, like even if you're at like DDR5 8000, your latency doesn't go like you can hit like 50 nanoseconds or 49 something. But yeah, like at that point you're talking like it. On the flip side, it also wasn't stable ever, so it's not exactly useful. I think I do want to do a little bit of testing with, like, bit more testing with this memory on this motherboard to see, like, if I throw all caution to the wind, how far could I push this if we didn't care about actually being able to, use the computer all day without blue screens or errors or file corruption. Because, yeah, that's, like, the main downside to memory overclocking is if you don't properly stress test it, you can destroy your operating system quite easily. Yeah. But anyway, solid IDA results. Not that like the main issue with IDA's benchmark is you can sometimes set up your memory in such a way that IDA will tell you that everything is performing fine, and then you run an actual benchmark and it'll run really slowly. But like that's not a concern here because I tuned the timings myself. But that is an issue I've run into with certain DDR4 memory kits having strange XMP profiles. Anyway, I guess I'll get the board back into the shot, at least the post LEDs, so that I know when to start mashing delete. And into the BIOS we go, and here we are. So, now the CPU, as you can see, is all on auto. The only thing I've done is turn off the E-cores over here, so I could turn them back on again. And then as we scroll down here, you can see, so we're in Gear 2 because, well, Gear 1 on DDR5 doesn't work, and Gear 4 is terrible for performance, and actually on this BIOS also doesn't work. Memory frequency, we're just on the 72 times 100 memory ratio. There's no difference between, like, the 100 times 1.3, like 54 times 100 times 1.33, and 72 times 100 times 1. There's no performance difference between these two settings. On some CPU, well, in the past, on some CPUs, on some motherboards, with in some scenarios, you would find that like one configuration is more stable than the other, but it didn't actually affect performance because this isn't some kind of like memory controller to memory clock ratio thing. It's just how the memory clock is generated. So the memory controller is the clock of the memory controller is actually controlled by the gear setting over here, right? So right now our memory controller is running half the clock of the memory. So at 7200 megabits per second, our memory runs 3600 megahertz, and our memory controller is running 1800 megahertz. Wait, am I getting that right? 3600 times 2 is 7200, and 3600 divided by 2 is 1800. Yes. So it's at 1800 megahertz right now. Anyway, so yeah, like if you're wondering about the two 7200 options here, I could have used either of them, but I used this one because that's just randomly whichever one I landed on is whichever one I used. Anyway, as we scroll down here, we get to our sort of CPU, well, to the voltages that I've actually set. So what's absolutely critical with this 13600K that I have here to get Y-Cruncher stable at high memory speeds is running well, actually, I'm not sure about the CPU PLL voltage over here. I'm not 100% certain if that one's necessary, but definitely the ring, system agent, and memory controller PLL voltages have to be manually tuned. This combination of 1.02, 1.02, and 0.99 works best, is basically the best combination for this CPU. Other CPUs might have different optimal PLL voltages. For example, my 13900KS actually just doesn't react to these voltages at all. So tuning the PLLs on that CPU is completely pointless. Tuning the PLLs on this 13600K, this is the optimal settings. And on my 13900K, I don't know what the optimal settings are, but they're not this. This doesn't work on my 13900K. Yeah, these do vary by CPU, so unfortunately you can't copy them from me. I think MSI does they let you go pretty high. I would generally not go above like 1.05 on any of these, or well, actually no, like 1. Yeah, I'd stay below like 1.0095 for these. And you will find that just setting these too high can actually cause more issues than it solves. The best way to try tune them is basically if you have some memory settings like do it at the as you go up in memory speed. As soon as you hit a point where like Y-Cruncher VST is like crashing really quickly, start slowly raising the PLL voltages. So like ring PLL, SA PLL, memory controller PLL, and potentially the CPU PLL. And hopefully what you'll start seeing is that the Y-Cruncher gets a bit more stable. So instead of crashing in like 15 seconds, it'll crash in like 40 seconds, and then a minute, maybe 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes. And then once you get it dialed in, you can run it for hours on end and it won't crash. So yeah, anyway, for this 13600K here, these are optimal. You might find that your CPU actually likes similar voltages. You might find that your CPU doesn't need adjusting these voltages at all. You might find that even if you do adjust these voltages, your CPU's memory controller just sucks and 7200 won't work anyway, but that I think would be extremely unlucky. Most CPUs should do 7200 if you coax them a bit with something like the PLL voltages here. Anyway, now let's talk about non-PLL voltages. So system agent I have at 1.2 volts, which is what the board actually sort of went to auto on its own. Is like on auto, it would go to 1.2 volts. So I just set the SA voltage to override mode and then manually set it to 1.2 volts so that the board doesn't randomly decide to change it because this works, this is stable. We don't want it to randomly change sometime in the future if the board like does something weird during memory training. Anyway, then we have CPU VDDQ and CPU VDD2. The VDDQ is a bit on the high side. Yeah, this might be a bit on the high side, but at 7200 it works just fine. It's stable, right? It ran all of the stress tests, and it's also on a little bit on the high side in the sense that I wouldn't recommend going above 1.45 volts for CPU VDDQ because this is an internal CPU voltage for the memory controller. So this is a voltage that if you set it really, really high, you could potentially damage your memory controller. And so I wouldn't go above 1.45 volts on that one for long-term use. And so 1.4 volts I do consider completely safe. I would have no worries about dailying this all day, every day for the next like 3-4 years. Probably even longer than that. Like my experience is CPUs tend to be kind of indestructible in a way, unless you do something really stupid to them. And yeah, so I'm not like it is a pretty high CPU VDDQ voltage for my experience, but it's not dangerous. And mostly I'm saying it's high because I've found that on a lot of other motherboards, when pushing DDR5, I would actually end up having to use a lower VDDQ voltage than this in order to get good stability, but this works here, like passes all the stress tests. So I'm not gonna put, if it works, don't make it not work, is basically my approach to it. So if 1.4, like the motherboard defaulted to 1.4 volts at DDR5-7200, it passes all the stress tests, works for me. I'll take 1.4 volts because it works. Like the main point of this sort of, I guess, series of videos to me was really to show that like you can get a good, well-performing DDR5 overclock with a not that expensive DDR5 memory kit and without too much effort, okay? Manually dialing in every voltage to its absolute minimum is too much effort, in my opinion. So we'll take 1.4 volts because it's not gonna hurt the CPU and it works. And that's pretty much all I care about when it comes to voltages. So then we have VDD2, which is at 1.4 volts. Again, the motherboard decided to use 1.4 volts, and so I was like, well, if it works, I'll take it. So I locked that into 1.4 volts. VDD2 you can push very, very high, and it's not going to hurt the CPU. Like even 1.6 volts of VDD2 is not going to hurt the CPU in any way, shape, or form. However, it's also generally not necessary to run it that high, and it does sweet spot, so which is true for basically most DDR5 voltages. So what I mean by that is in some scenarios you might find that like a lower VDD2 might be best or a higher VDD2 might be best. Depends on your motherboard, kind of depends on your CPU. depends on your memory kit. This board defaulted to 1.4 volts. It runs all the stress tests at 1.4 volts. I'm not going to question it past that point. Also, it's definitely not dangerous, and the motherboard even agrees with me, like it's highlighted in white. Actually, MSI also agrees with me about the VDDQ being a little bit on the high side because that's in red. Though I disagree with them about the voltages being red, because 1.45 volts is a regular XMP voltage that you'll see on many, many DDR5 kits these days. So I have no idea why they're highlighting that in red, because there's like a whole bunch of memory kits that you can buy. You turn on XMP and you're going to get 1.45 volts. So I don't know why they're so worried about that. But yeah, so DRAM voltage and DRAM VDDQ are both set to 1.45 volts. These might be... Well, no, these are, like I said, this is a voltage that you'd see on a lot of XMP profiles regularly, so these really aren't high. They might be more than is necessary to get these settings stable with this memory kit on this board, but again, I don't want to spend, you know, hours and hours and hours, potentially days, minimizing every voltage. That's a waste of time. This is stable. It performs well. Past that point, I don't care. And 1.45 volts is not going to break the memory sticks, or the motherboard, or the CPU. So, yeah, we don't have to worry about that. So anyway, that's the voltage settings, and I didn't really adjust anything else, because again, this was supposed to be a low-effort DDR5 overclock, which with Intel is in some cases a lot to ask for. So I'm happy that this works, and I am not going to touch it. Anyway, let's take a look at the actual memory timing. So TCL, so command rate, we're at 2N. 1N just straight up doesn't work at speeds this high. Maybe with a different BIOS it might, but like 1N versus 2N doesn't make too much of a performance difference, so it's just fine. Anyway, and in most scenarios for DDR5, if you're pushing north of like DDR5-6400, you're probably going to end up with 2N command rate. There's just, yeah, that's just how things go. Anyway, below that we have our CAS latency, which is at 34. This might go a little bit lower, but not a lot lower. So maybe 32 would work. It also, the thing is, going from 34 to 32 isn't going to drastically change performance. And, well, basically, like I said, like I wanted a low effort, good overclock. Not a perfect overclock. This is, I would consider this like 90 to 95% of the potential performance of this setup, but with like an hour of time investment and then 12 hours of stress testing instead of potentially days of back and forth between, you know, settings, voltages, stress tests, like, yeah. So that's kind of like, it's going to be TCL34, and sure, it might go lower, especially if you decided to go higher on the memory voltages. You might be able to push TCL quite a bit lower, but like, it's not going to drastically change the performance. Because like, it's not like you're going to go from CAS latency 34 to CAS latency 24, right? And since you're only going to be lowering it by like 2 or 4 ticks, like this timing is literally 2 digits. You're barely making a difference to it. Anyway, TRCD's at 44. This also might go a little bit lower, like 43 might work, 42 might also work. On some memory kits. On some kits it won't, actually. Like, and this kit may very well be a kit that just doesn't work below 44. But again, like lowering your CAS latency by TRCD timing by a couple ticks is just not going to drastically change performance. So don't bother. Anyway, TRCDW is at 16. This is just a timing that you can set very, very low. And it might even go lower than this, but 16, the issue with TRCDW is not only, like, you can set it very low, but unfortunately it's not really performance critical. Like, it makes even less of a difference to performance than, say, TCL and TRCD do. Of the primary timings, these two, along with the command rate, these 3 timings sort of make the biggest difference to performance, but even these 3, if you're only adjusting them by like 1 or 2 ticks, really don't do much. And then you get to TRCDW, which is basically the delay from an activate command to a write command. And under most circumstances, your CPU is not going to be like desperately trying to write data to the memory. That's just not a thing, okay? You might find in a lot of scenarios that your memory controller is desperately trying to get some information from the memory to the cores, but the other way round, it's pretty unlikely. And so TRCDW doesn't really do much for performance. So while we can set it incredibly low, and it could probably go lower than 16, it also isn't like performance critical in any way, shape, or form. So like, yeah, I punched in 16. 16 works, and I'll take that. Also, I'm pretty sure we can't set it below 8 anyway. Yeah, I'm relatively certain that we shouldn't be able to set it that low. There's a register limit somewhere in I think it's in the 1-digit range. It might be 4 or 8 that you can't set it below. And it might also stop being stable somewhere in that range. But anyway, let's move on to TRP. TRP is at 44. This might go down a tick or two. A lot of the time, TRP can run like one or two ticks lower than TRCD with Hynix memory chips. But TRP makes very little difference to performance in most scenarios. Actually, I'd say all scenarios, because even like your super memory latency intensive benchmarks, like TRP helps a little bit, but that's because those benchmarks will react basically to any timing adjustment, not even like good ones. So, yeah, TRP 44 because this was supposed to be low effort, and it is. Anyway, TRAS at 28 because that is the Intel well, that's according to Intel's documentation, you shouldn't be able to set TRAS below 28. Now, motherboards will regularly let you go below 28, but I don't know if that actually does anything or if the memory controller ends up just auto-correcting it back up to 28. And it's really hard to test because TRAS doesn't have, like, it does have some performance impact, but it's not a ton of performance impact, and so it's kind of hard to reliably test TRAS once you're, at 28 compared to like 24 or something. Anyway, then we have TRFC, which is at 300, and TRFC2, which we have at 333, because this is a Hynix MDI kit, so we can run very low TRFC2, like 333. If you had a Hynix ADI-based kit, then you'd probably end up with a TRFC2 of like 450, maybe 400, something like that. Anyway, then we have TRFC per bank, which we can run at 222 because this is Hynix MDI, and this works at 7,200 megabits per second. Then we have the refresh interval, which I have at 50,000. If you wanted to, you could bump this up to like 100,000. It really shouldn't affect stability in any way, shape, or form at 7,200. Actually, the funny thing about refresh interval is, so most timings actually get shorter as you increase your memory. Actually, no, all timings get shorter as you increase your memory clock because your clock cycles get shorter and timings are measured in clock cycles. So as you go up in clock, your timings get shorter in like nanoseconds get shorter. TREFI is the one timing where this is not a good thing because the refresh interval controls how frequently we send a refresh command to the memory. And so as you increase your memory clock, the gap between refresh commands gets smaller if you don't constantly increase your refresh interval. So like 50,000 refresh interval at 7,200 is actually, or well, I shouldn't be saying 7,200 because the memory clock is actually 3,600 megahertz right now. But so our refresh interval right now is actually shorter than 50,000 at say DDR5-6000. Even though it's like the same number. So if we wanted to like offset that, we'd have to run it at like 60 or something. But anyway, the thing is, because the refresh interval controls how frequently we send refresh commands, we could raise it like, and actually the register limit for this timing is insanely high. Goes all the way up to 262,000, at which point you might actually start running into some serious stability issues depending on what temperature your memory sticks are at and that kind of thing. But up to like 100,000, it generally works just fine. Even over quite a bit over 100,000, you shouldn't really be running into any issues. But the thing is, if your refresh cycle is 300 cycles and you're sending a refresh every 50,000 cycles, like less than 1% of your memory's clock cycles are being used by refreshing. So increasing the refresh interval further isn't really going to significantly change your performance, because you're going to go from like, actually, we're just going to pull up the calculator for this. I don't know why that's there. Anyway, so we're going to, let's say we went from, say, 50, well, right now we have like 333 divided by, no, divided by 50,000, right? And so 0.66% of our available clock cycles are being used to refresh. And if we bumped it up to 100,000, well, that would mean we'd have 0.33% of our available clock cycles would be getting used to refresh. It won't make much of a performance difference, because we're literally improving our like utilization of memory by like 0.33%, right? Because the other 99.4, like 99% of our clock cycles, those are available for reads, writes, and that's actually sort of everything you do with memory. I mean, there's also like pre-charge commands and activate commands, but those are just like padding around the read and write commands, right? That's the part we care about. So yeah, we could bump up the refresh interval. At this point, though, it's really not going to make a drastic difference to performance, and it will make the memory sticks more temperature sensitive. I do have a fan on them, so I could probably get away with it, or even like 150,000 probably, but again, it wouldn't make a huge performance difference, so I'm not going to bother with that here. Then we have TRRD and TRRDL. These are at 4.8 because 4.6 does not work, and these are on the register limit. It's also worth noting that actually, well, like 8.8 with DDR5 is not going to perform much different from 4.8, just because the advantage of 4.8 is basically a scheduling benefit where you can, like, the memory controller can, like, schedule activate commands around other commands like reads and writes with more easily if the activate commands can be grouped closer together. So there's not like a direct performance impact once you go below 8, just because DDR5 uses an 8-cycle burst length. Yeah, this is Hynix MDI, so 4.8, and actually even Hynix ADI, you will find 4.8 at these speeds is sort of going to be your limit a lot of the time, unless you shove a bunch of voltage into the memory sticks, in which case you might be able to run 4.4. Anyway, then we get TFAW, which is set to 16. It doesn't go lower than that, at least according to the Intel documentation. And so trying to set it lower than that is pointless. Also, setting it lower than 16 when your TRRD is at 4 won't do anything, because the way that that timing works is it basically just adds extra delay on top of your TRRD timings. So if your TRRD timings are 4.8, your shortest 4 activate shortest set of 4 activates is going to be 16 cycles, and your longest set is going to be 32 cycles, because you'll have 4 TRRDLs back to back. So you'll have like 32 cycles in total. So a TFAW of less than 16 in this scenario isn't going to do anything, because our the shortest amount of time in which we can send 4 activates is 16 cycles, and the longest is 32 cycles. So, yeah, we don't have to, so that's why that's at 16, and that's also why we don't have to set it below 16. And actually, generally, I would say if you're tuning any DDR, you set your TFAW as low as it goes, and then you just worry about your TRRD timings instead, because this literally just adds extra delay on top of the TRRD timings. So if your TRRD, if you have a really loose TFAW, it's literally the same thing. Well, it's not exactly the same. You do have potential scheduling benefits if your TRRDs are kind of short, but for the most part, it's the same as having really loose TRRDs if you have a loose TFAW. So TFAW to the register limit, and then worry about TRRDL instead. I mean, TRRD and TRRDL instead. Anyway, then we get TCWL. This is Hynix MDI. It does crazy low cast write latency. I mean, it also does crazy low TRCDW. This might even go lower than this, but unfortunately, like I mentioned with TRCDW, most CPUs, or more like most processing scenarios, are not write limited, not to the memory anyway. So lowering this more would probably work. I don't think it would come down much more than this, but maybe like 18 would still work. However, it would really not change performance very much because in most circumstances, you are not write limited, right? Like read limited, sure. Write limited, nah. So, um, yeah, which also you could take that to mean like we could have just left it at like 32, like set it to 32, and that would also work. But like I already have a lot of experience with Hynix memory kits, so I punched in TCWL24 when I was setting this overclock up because in my experience, a lot of the time at this kind of memory speed, this will work. If you didn't want to, if you didn't want to rely on like hours and hours and hours of experience in order to be able to randomly punch in a number like that and have it work, the general rule of thumb that you take your cast latency and subtract 2 from it is an option. And it's not going to cost you a whole lot of performance because, again, it only affects write operations, which aren't that important. So, yeah, but anyway, TCWL24 for me worked here, so that's why we're going to leave it there. TCK is at 4. Off the top of my head, I can't remember what this timing does, but it doesn't go below 4. I do remember that the register limit for it is 4. So that's why it's at 4. And then we get to our back-to-back timings, or turnaround timings, or tertiary timings. I like calling them back-to-back timings because it's like read to read, so it's a back-to-back read. And then you have like write to write, which is back-to-back writes, and then you have read to write, which is a read back-to-back with a write, right? Anyway, I don't know where I've seen it called back-to-back timings. I didn't come up with that on my own. I've seen it somewhere, and I liked it. So anyway. Read to read, same group as at 14. It might do 12, but 14 is already very tight, and so yeah, we're not gonna try push it. It's also worth noting, well, so 13.7, I can pretty much guarantee would work. The reason I'm saying that is, as far as I can tell, the Intel memory controller automatically rounds these numbers up to the nearest even value. So 7 and 8 have the same performance, 7 and 8 have the same performance, 13 and 14 have the same performance, 9 and 10 have the same performance, and that kind of thing. So, yeah, that's why I have these at like 14, like why these are, well, that's why like you'll see a lot of people always have these in even values because they get rounded if they're odd. At least I think it does it for all of them. I would suspect it even does it for these, which you regularly see. Like I've seen a lot of other people have these set to odd values, but yeah, I guess I could do a bit more testing on that. But anyway, 14.8 for high. Well, yeah, this is reasonably tight. 12.8 might work. 6 definitely doesn't because again, DDR5 uses an 8 cycle burst length. So you can't have you can't send another read burst within 6 cycles of a different read burst, right? Because they'd overlap, and so that's not an option. So 6 definitely isn't possible. So that's kind of that. Well, 10 actually does work, but only at very low memory clocks. So for the same group timing. And we're at 7200, so that's not going to work. I mean, well, the clock is 3600 megahertz. The data rate is 7200 right now. Anyway, write to write. Yeah, Hynix is just really good at doing write commands for some reason. So you can run, like with most Hynix memory chips for DDR5, you can run your write to write timings at least 2 ticks lower than your read-to-read timings. And this is very consistent. On a lot of other DDR5 memory sticks, this doesn't work, and you're going to end up with your write-to-write being either very similar to your read-to-read or significantly higher. This is like a Hynix thing where for some reason they just, like, and you can also see it on things like the cast-write latency, right? Like the cast-write latency being okay at 24 is kind of insane. And this is basically another example of just like, yeah, these sticks handle write command, like, well, Hynix chips seem to handle write operations just really well, so you can run them really low. Anyway, then we have the read to write timings. These could be lower. They aren't because they don't tend to go much below like 1818, and the difference between 20 and 18 is not much. So I can't be bothered with dealing with the stress testing of those two. It probably wouldn't crash, not at 7200. Yeah, at 7200, I don't think it would really cause any stability issues. But I don't feel like, well, it also wouldn't make any drastic performance differences. But this is one of the lower risk adjustments you could make to these settings without having to change anything else. That would probably work along with the TREFI. Like, I think if you were copying my timings here and you wanted like a smidge more performance, you could bump the TREFI to like 100,000 and you could lower these two by from 20 to 18, and I would expect it to work. And if it doesn't, then you can go back to 50,000 and 2020. Anyway, then we have right to read, same group and different group. Different group is reasonably tight. Same group is actually pretty loose. It's tighter than what you'd get with an XMP profile, but it would probably do something in the 50s if I could actually be bothered to deal with tuning this timing, which I can't, which is why it's at 64. So yeah, that's what's going on with that one. Then we get to our right. We have write precharge and read precharge over here. Write precharge, again, Hynix chips. We're just crazy about write operations. We can run it at 48. Actually, we could probably even run it at 44, and that would still work. But 48 is what I ended up with. Like, the thing is, you can set the right precharge timing on Hynix memory sticks just crazy low, and it just works. I guess it's a similar situation to the cast write latency being... Well, actually, it's probably a direct consequence of the cast write latency being very low. Because the way Intel actually implements the write to... Like, what write to precharge does with Intel CPUs is this is from the actual write command itself, not from the end of the write burst. So if you had a very... Like, if your cast write latency timing was actually really high, then you can't run TWR pre super low because your write would like overlap with the precharge command, which would be bad. But I think even with a cast write latency of 32, you should be okay because the write itself is only 8 cycles long. So yeah, you'd still have like from 32 to 48, you'd have your 8 cycle write, and then yeah, that should still work out. Anyway. I'm making this video terrible. Also, it's 40 minutes long. How does this keep happening? I was like, it's just going to be a short video about how, like, everything was stable and these are the settings that I ended up with. And then I get carried away by explaining all the different timings. Yay me. Anyway, we've got read to precharge, which is at 8. It can go lower. On Hynix MDI, it can go lower than this. It also doesn't... It's not going to drastically change performance. And there is a right... I'd have to look up what the register limit is for it, but I wouldn't necessarily be surprised if a 4 did work, which is just crazy low. But yeah, Hynix memory chips just, especially MDI, just has some really crazy timings that work. Anyway. TPPD is on auto because at least according to the Intel documentation, it's not implemented for DDR5, and I don't know why it's available. Well, I guess it's similar to the Gear 1 option on the main page where it's like, I don't know why you have Gear 1 as an option on a DDR5 motherboard because it doesn't work. And TPPD for DDR5, as far as according to Intel's documentation, is not used. So we can just pretend that doesn't exist. Then TXP's at 4. TXP DLL, I've not really put any time into tuning this timing, so I've left that one on auto. And actually, I should say that basically all of these timings over here, so like TXP is the delay from exiting power down mode, which is like a idle state for the memory sticks, to a command. And the thing is, and then we have like power down enable timings. That's the PDEN timing. So we have like, actually, if I remember correctly, this one's any command to power down enable, read command to power down enable, and a write command to power down enable. And yeah, you can pretty much, in my experience, you can always set these to 244. This works everywhere in my experience. And the other thing is, they also really shouldn't do anything, assuming that the power down mode disable function in the BIOS actually does what it says it does and disables power down mode. So if you disable power down mode, TXP, like, it should never be used because TXP very specifically applies to exiting the power down state. And so if your memory never, like if you disable power down mode, it's never going to be in a power down state, and it's just never going to have to exit it. Therefore, TXP won't do anything. But if your motherboard, like if you can't disable the power down mode, then setting TXP to 4 does give you a pretty nice bump to memory latency, as in like lowers your memory latency, because basically what would happen, like the memory controller, well, it makes sense if you have a laptop, but unfortunately, yeah, so you have like this laptop behavior on desktop CPUs where the memory controller will very aggressively try to put the memory sticks to sleep or put them into like the power down state. And then when it has to wake them up because it wants to read from a memory stick, the TXP timing basically delays how quickly the memory stick, how quickly after waking up the memory stick you actually send a read command or a write command, or really, actually you wouldn't be sending a read, well, no, you could, because you can actually put the, because basically it just disables the IO portion of the memory stick. So you just like can't read or like you can't read or write, but the memory stick otherwise is still fully active. It's just you can't you can't do anything with it. And the idea behind power down mode is it saves like a few fractions of a watt per memory rank, but like it's a desktop CPU. Why is this a thing? I have no idea. And we have a bunch of timings that are related to controlling this, and they're here. And if you can't disable power down mode, then this does still, like, these work in terms of stability. Here, they obviously work either because power down mode is disabled or because they just work in general. Anyway, I wish, I do wish the information for, like, especially Intel memory controllers was a little bit less of a mess. Anyway, so that's, I think, all the timings that I've actually set. Because there's also a bunch of timings which, as far as I know, these all should be, like, calibration timings instead of anything that we would have to worry about once the memory, like, is already posted. So these are all timings that I would generally not try to set manually over here. Actually, yeah. Well, TREFI X9, no, the board defaulted that to 255, so we don't have to adjust that. It doesn't go higher than that anyway. Anyway, then down here we have the RTL timings, which are in dynamic mode. And then when we get to here, everything else is just auto, because, yeah. I mean, well, the thing is, like, if your motherboard is doing a good job of the memory training, you shouldn't have to set your, like, drive reference voltages, yeah, drive VREF, you shouldn't have to configure this, you shouldn't have to set your terminations. Like, the motherboard and the memory controller should be taking care of that. And the motherboard, when I say motherboard should be taking care of that, I really mean the BIOS, not the hardware itself. The hardware on the motherboard, as far as the memory is related, is basically just a bunch of wires. Actually, it's quite literally just a bunch of wires. that's really all there is between the CPU's memory controller and the memory sticks, is a bunch of wires and some DIMM slots and a CPU socket. So, yeah. Oh, well, we've got more termination settings. Yeah, because DDR5 made termination even more complicated than it already was. Luckily, this board's BIOS does quite a good job of them, because even with these MDI sticks, like, it can boot all the way up to 7200, and not having the terminations set correctly won't really affect what memory timings you can run. It drastically impacts the memory clocks, because it basically affects the signal quality, and the higher the clock you're trying to run, the more important it is to have good signal quality. So, yeah. Anyway, let's take a look at the training configuration, because there is a few adjustments I've made. I've disabled late command training because, well, I'm not sure if with MSI board, like, MSI boards might have this disabled in the auto configuration. But in my experience, late command training, at least on, say, motherboards where it isn't disabled, when you're pushing high memory speeds, this causes a bunch of, like, post issues, and it doesn't improve stability. So there's absolutely no reason to have this enabled, because it doesn't do anything except prevent you from getting into Windows, basically. Like, even if you have it enabled, and your system boots up, like you can still be unstable, and sometimes it won't boot up. Like that's all it really does. Once you're at very high memory speeds. So I have this disabled if we're doing memory overclocking because it doesn't help. Um, and yeah, well, it doesn't help stability and it only makes it more difficult to boot. So there's just no benefit to having that enabled. Anyway, round trip latency, I have this turned on, which alongside having the round trip timing mode set to dynamic, which is that? Oh, whoa, that's really nice. Yeah. So having the latency timing setting mode and dynamic mode, that should make the board train the RTLs during post, and that can basically improve memory latency a little bit. Yeah, though I should warn you with some CPUs, and I've not run into this with 13th gen, but with 12th gen, turning on round trip latency on some timing, I mean, on some CPUs would just cause massive instability because the memory controller would basically train a bunch of round trip latencies that are way too tight, way tighter than what the CPU is actually capable, than what it's actually capable of running, and you just have massive instability. And yeah, it would be faster, but like, it wouldn't be stable at all. I've not run into that with 13th gen at all so far, but that is something like if you're on a 12th gen CPU and you're watching this video to like learn about memory overclocking in general, yeah, on 12th gen round trip latency can cause massive stability issues. So this is one of those settings where it's like you turn it on, if stability gets really bad, you turn it right back off, because it's not worth it. Like it really just yeah, like on some CPUs it basically just doesn't work is the best way I can describe it. So yeah, that's it. This video went way overboard. I guess I'll highlight the only like adjustments that I feel like I would make to this. So potentially you could run lower write to read, maybe even also yeah, like the write to read timings could maybe come down a little bit. These two can almost certainly do 18. It's not going to drastically change performance, but they could probably do 18. What else is there? Cast write latency might go a little bit lower than I have it. TREFI, you could bump that up to 100,000. It's not really going to change anything, but you could. And then the primary timings, all of them might come down 1 or 2 ticks, depending on your like how lucky you got with your memory kit. TRFC would probably also be able to come down a bit. Same for per bank, but like it's not like you're not going to be dropping TRFC2 from 333 to like 200. And even if you did, like again, your TREFI is so high that it's not going to drastically improve performance. So, yeah. Anyway, and in terms of voltages, I would actually change nothing in terms of voltages. So, yeah, that's it for this video. Hopefully this is somewhat helpful if you like. Yeah, hopefully this is somewhat helpful if you're tuning DDR5 on an MSI motherboard. Now, admittedly, you know, I'm on an ITX motherboard, so it has a 1 DIMM per channel memory topology instead of a daisy chain, so this board, in terms of memory clocks, should generally be better in terms of what it can achieve compared to ATX motherboards. At the same time, though, I'm using a Hynix MDI kit, and MDI generally doesn't achieve high clock speeds with, well, isn't stable at the same kind of speeds that Hynix ADI is. So you might find that if you have like ADI on an ATX motherboard, you can actually run similar speeds to what I'm doing here. But yeah, if you had ADI on this motherboard, I would actually expect you to be able to do 7600. And it really doesn't, like, I would, like, for me, the main point of this video and the previous video was that, like, you don't need a DDR5-7200 rated kit in order to do DDR5-7200. You just need a Hynix-based memory kit, and then you need to know, like, how to tune the memory, which for the most part is just, like, bump the memory voltages up to, like, 1.45, and then, you know, punch in, like, some basic memory time. Like, you don't even need to, well, just watch the other video. That one covers the memory tuning process quite well. This one is more like, these are the results. This is stable. It's fast. These are the kinds of timings you could expect with other Hynix kits. especially M-die kits. Again, A-die, you wouldn't really be able to run the same TRFC timings that I'm using here. But everything else actually on A-die is generally pretty similar. Also, other than the read to pre-charge. I have read to pre-charge at 8 here. If you're on an A-die kit, you'll probably have to have it at 12 or higher. Especially once you're at like DDR5-7200. Anyway, yeah, that's it for the video. So hopefully this is helpful. So thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon. There's a link to that down in the description below. There's also the AHOC Teespring store where you can pick up shirts, hoodies, posters, you know, the usual YouTuber merch. And I've also got a Bandcamp, and there's a link to that down in the description below as well. And that's it. So thanks for watching, and goodbye.